One of the things that moved my poetry into this separate entity that people talk about is the fact that at age 20, I came from a limited language, Cuban, a concept that doesn't exist. What exists is Spanish, and you have the classical difference between language and speech. In Spanish is lengua, lenguaje, and habla. We all have a lenguaje. The animals have a lenguaje. The plants have a lenguaje. Each of us has un idioma, a language. Yours is English, mine is Spanish. And we have hablas. You talk, say, with a California accent, and you incorporate many Californian ways. Myself, Cuban, but Cuba from Havana, Cuban from the 1960s, so on and so forth. That's the habla. So I came out of Cuba with that which is very localized. I come to New York, the megalopolis, with all the Spanish coming in.
What was New York like then?
In the 60s, it was dead from the language point of view, because I had no contact with Spanish. There was no Spanish. There were Puerto Ricans, and there was this horrible Spanish advertising things in subways or giving instructions in subways that was obviously done by Puerto Ricans who were not equipped to do it in terms of translation, whom they probably gave $20 to do the job, And you should see how atrocious the language was. That has changed completely after, say, the 80s. But it took a long time for this to change. Even the other day, 2 days ago, I'm catching this plane to come here, JetBlue, and there's an ad at the entrance of the airplane in English and in Spanish. The Spanish has 3 orthographical mistakes that really pisses me off. This is inscribed in the fuselage of the plane. They cannot spend $100 to pay a good translator to do an adequate translation. And the other thing that pisses me off is that all the Spanish that you see around, and this has changed for the better, is usually a literal translation of the English, which doesn't call for the fluidity of the language, the true fluidity of the language. If you're talking English, talk English. If you're talking Spanish, talk Spanish. And if you're talking Spanglish, talk Spanglish. I have nothing against that. Jesus, don't fuck around with so-called the orthodoxy of the language. There's a kind of respect for that we all need to communicate.
How did coming to New York, because I know New York was so alive in the 60s and the Village and everything. Tell me about that time period.
I was very fortunate. I mean, I always say in 1964 I was drinking French wines for $1 that today would cost $2,000-$3,000 if you find them, and that's a fact. So I was fortunate in the sense that I come into a United States who is opening up to a lot of things racially, sexually. I have a great admiration for the 20th century. This is the century that, historically speaking, faced for the first time so many things that we didn't dare face. I mean, we lived 2,000 years exploiting women, exploiting children, racially diminishing each other, sexually diminishing each other, not accepting alternative ways of sexuality, like being gay or whatever. One of my daughters is gay, and it's an open thing in my family. It's no big deal. But this is a 20th century situation, and we owe it to this 20th century that dealt with this heroically. This is, to me, the true heroism of the 20th century, and not its fucking wars. There's no heroism in war. There's heroism in dealing with your wife at home in a decent way, or with a friend in the daily relationship, if you want to consider friendship something sacred and something important, and something that means growth for the two friends, So that I have a great admiration for that 20th century, and I come in the 60s when this is post World War II with all that means, but it's also pre-Vietnam War, which is the first highly unjust war that the United States is engaged with after the glorious World War II. So the sense of resistance and the sense of hell no, we won't go was exciting. and it's dead now in this country. To be fair, it's dead now in the entire Occidental world, and let's forget about the Oriental world, which is totally oppressed. So the contrast to me is so clear, and when my children sit with us at home and I begin to talk about the 60s, they ask me to stop talking because it hurts them. It hurts them in the sense that, Dad, we are slaves, we are caught in a situation where, there's no present, there's no future economically. You were poor and you were richer than we are. So don't talk about this, it hurts. And there's a kind of, like envy or jealousy or, man, you were lucky. I always say luck is an element of one's life and one's reality, but luck also has to be recognized. When I entered the American system, the American university system, I was very fortunate, very fortunate. But as a poet, I realized that this is it for me. This is. I recognized that the American university system was going to give me enough of a salary to support the family. My wife never worked. My wife raised the children orthodoxly, and it was going to give me all the freedom that only a multimillionaire can have. So, I spent 32 years in New York City, living fairly well. I always had a second house in Spain. I always had 4 months a year free. I caught a plane on the 28th of May, went to my house in Spain, and wrote. The dream of a poet, the dream of a writer. There was nothing in there that called for being self-destructive. It was healthy, but you had to recognize the good luck. You had to recognize that the system was giving you something that if you handled properly, it meant that you could be the writer that you think you are. This can be applied to a writer, but it can be applied to any citizen. It can be applied to any citizen. So yes, there is luck, but yes, there is also recognizing situations clearly. And I had that clarity of mind, as I say in Zen Buddhism, that allow me to see the issue, grab the situation to my favor, somehow exploit it a little bit, but decently. I believe in decency, and at the same time, do my thing. It was a very rich period. I come from Cuba having read the French symbolists in lousy, third-rate translations, reading Mallarmé or Baudelaire or Rimbaud or Verlaine in those translations. It was a great opportunity, having so far only read the Cuban poets or the Cuban heroical literature, and not much beyond that. Here I come to the States, age 20. What's the first thing that I encounter? Lorca's poet in New York, in a bilingual translation. That is to say, the Spanish and the English. But I encounter Kenneth Rexroth and his books on Japanese and Chinese poetry. It changes my life. This could not have happened in Cuba.
I noticed the Japanese influence in here.
Oh yeah. All Oriental influence, and you don't see it this much in there. You see it, for instance, look at the title, Tokonoma. The Tokonoma.
So you've spent a lot of time in Japan from time.
I've never been to Japan. I've translated a lot of Japanese literature. I don't know a word of Japanese. I did it through English. I did it through translations that were done from Japanese to English by normally, for instance, Saigyo, the Japanese Zen monk poet of the 12th century, has a beautiful book called Mirror of the Moon. It was translated by a fellow by the name of William Lafleur, who's extraordinary and totally forgotten, but extraordinary. It was published by New Directions.
Mirror of the Moon?
Mirror of the Moon.
I'm going to write that down.
I translated that into Spanish as Espejo de la Luna. And it sold. I didn't make a penny, but I don't care. It sold. And I was literally in the Hispanic world the first, the word in Spanish is divulgador, when you become like a vehicle for things, divulgar, make it vulgar, make it common to everyone, make it available. I made Japanese and Chinese literature for the first time in Spanish available in our world, and this has been acknowledged at many levels. Why this happened to me? Because I'm a genius? No, because I was lucky to be in New York where this was happening, in the 1960s. You know perfectly well the impact of the Oriental world in the 1960s in the Beat generation and in so many other. To this day, Philip Whalen or our friend Michael McClure, you know, they are descendants of this issue, as in a sense I am. And I think the Jew in me was very apt and very open to further influences or further cultures, because if we are diasporic, we're constantly in touch with anything and everything, and anything and everything ought to influence your life and your work. What's wrong with that?
Yeah.
Democracy of the soul. Democracy of the soul.
I had so many different things I wanted to ask you about, but I've just been learning a lot about like Nick Norpara and some of these guys. Yeah. And who would you tell my generation and young people of Americans to look in as far as Latin American poets, or to open up their horizons with, say, Latin American poetry or Spanish poetry? Who would be a good place to start?
I mean, obviously, Vallejo, Parra, Neruda are the names to consider, because they've become the classical names. I would add, which is less known in this country, Huidobro, the Chilean poet, Vicente Huidobro, who, you know, was very involved with France and surrealism and something called creacionismo. To me, he is more important as poet and a seminal poet than for instance, Neruda.
Neruda is great, but it's sometimes some of these guys, they become such figureheads that they're not even as...
Yeah, but Neruda is also a lousy poet. You know, he was defined by Juan Ramon Jimenez in The Best of All Manners. He called him a great bad poet, wherein when he is good or great, he is. The residencias or the odas elementales are unbelievably beautiful. His political poetry is sophomorish to a degree that is embarrassing, and a lot of his so-called serious poetry, it's also embarrassing. I have a theory that some people agree with, which is he drank too much and he couldn't handle drink. One glass of wine is very good for poetry. 2 glasses of wine is also good. 3 glasses of wine ruins the poem. So there's got to be a control. It's impossible to write spontaneously without a control, without a consciousness of what you're doing, which you normally deal with when you're editing the spontaneous outburst, you know. There's a comment that I hear lately a lot about my work, which is very, I mean, if it's true, I'm an immortal, and people say, you are the only case that I know of someone who writes constantly these long, complex poems, and every poem is good. I mean, I'm not saying this, it would be too much vanity for me to say this about my work, but people are saying it constantly. And there's this kind of amazement and sense of monstrosity about what I do. Now, being prolific is not the issue. I have the feeling that most poets are extremely prolific. You live to write, and if you live 70 years or 80 years, you're going to leave an opus that is large. To improvise an example, both Amalio and Paul are not obviously as prolific as I am. Yet I am sure that between what they have already written, and in both cases, I admire the quality of what they have done and how different their work is. Possibly compared to what they're hiding from the reader, what's in there, hidden in the bathroom or whatever, I'm sure that one day when they, go, when they die, a lot of work is going to show up. We all keep material aside which we do not consider part of our work, because we are still infested by a false romanticism that says, and I've gone through this endlessly, oh, Kozer couldn't be a good poet because he writes too much. Quantity is the enemy, and I say quantity is my best friend. It's part of my experiment with poetry. It contains my failures, it contains what I have not seen well or achieved, but it allows me to, in a Confucian way, to constantly review and redress what I'm doing. What's wrong with quantity? You know? So that in going back to your question, yes, Parra, yes, Huidobro, yes, Vallejo. I mean, you must consider Darío, who has a kind of very intellectual level, which I don't care for, as in the case of Wallace Stevens, but has a more spontaneous level that I think is magnificent, as in the case of Wallace Stevens. When Wallace Stevens stops being the executive, he becomes the greatest poet. When he remains the executive, he becomes too intellectual. And that, for me, doesn't work as well. The same thing happens with Darío. There's a Darío that complains about the United States, complains about, politically speaking, certain issues that deal with the Anglo-Saxon world versus
I read a couple of those.
Yeah, and they're highly intellectual and well elaborated poems, but they're not really great poems. Now, when Darío is creating a poem about a certain mulatto woman who represents the exploited woman in Paris in the late 19th century, and the white guy that comes in and it's buying her off, and the way he handles that in terms of beauty, in terms of delicacy, in terms of an issue that is painful to a human being, yet he doesn't handle it in terms of, Cuba sí, Yankees no, none of that crap. He's a great poet. So, in terms of, for instance, just in Chile, to stay there, Enrique Lin, Lihn, which is not that much known, I think is a very important poet. Jorge Teillier, Teiller, is an extremely important poet and not very well known. And these are seminal poets in Latin America, which are read by the young with great admiration and with great love, and also they learn a lot from them. So there's a lot to be done that has to do with translation, and translation here has to go both ways. Who is going to translate to my Spanish and to the world of Latin America, which is starving for this? Who is going to translate Lorraine Lideker? Who is going to translate Louis Zukowski? We're waiting for this.
I like Zukowski.
Well, Zukowski's A is barely translated into Spanish. I've seen in Mexico maybe 3-4 translations of the shortest poems in A. None of the longest are translated. The beginning of A, which is magnificent, where he deals with Carnegie Hall and Bach and the concert, there's nothing translated. We were talking about Paul Metcalf last night, remember? Who I think is a great American writer. Prose, this is not poetry. Not a word. Totally unknown, not a word. Rexroth is not translated. Rexroth biographies are not translated. So, a lot has to be done both ways. In order for this to function, what do you need? You need money. Where the hell is the money? Power doesn't want to invest a penny on any of this. You know what I say to Power? Okay, go ahead. You're killing yourself. You're destroying the nation. And this is going to happen. People are bored. I created the new term in Spanish, which is la generación cabizbaja. Cabizbaja. Cabeza. Con la cabeza baja. They're with the gadgets all day long, They live this way. La generación cabizbaja, with the head down. People don't look at each other anymore. People are constantly, there's no eye contact. There's no touching. They are with the fucking gadgets. You know why? Because they're bored. They have nothing to do. They cannot face the eyes of another. They simply cannot face reality anymore. So they're living in a virtual, fictitious way. You mean to tell me this is not going to be...
They have to pay for that.
Of course they're going to have to pay for that. They are going to
pay. Now they're going to pay.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I agree 100%. This is in the works for the whole of the Occidental world. You'll see it. You'll see the Facebook syndrome and the Twitter syndrome, its effects after the 4 bastards that control this market made their money for nothing because they're also bored. The wives are making them cuckold. Their children hate them. This is a glass menagerie, as Tennessee Williams would say. It's crazy what's going on. I have nothing against money. I love money.
Self-induced alienation.
Exactly. I love Amalio's phrase that says, I need lots of money because I like to live very well. You know, and it's a great phrase. It's an honest phrase. You know, well, I want money. You know, I want a nice pair of pants, but I don't want a nice pair of pants instead of you being able to also have a nice pair of pants. If everybody can have it, I'm comfortable morally, and I'm comfortable also physically because you're not going to attack me. There's going to be no violence. You have no justification to attack me. But if I have a pair of Nike shoes and some Haitian guy in Haiti wants them and has no access to it, he's going to kill me for my fucking pair of Nike shoes. You know? And this is happening.
Well, you're talking